Good evening. Hello, I'm Danielle Smith. I'm the host of the Danielle Smith Report, and I'd like to welcome you to this special energy town hall to discuss why the world needs more Canadian oil and natural gas. It is sponsored and presented by the News Forum, along with being co-sponsored by Alberta Enterprise Group, Modern Miracle Network, and, of course, my co-host tonight, who is Catherine Swift, president of the Coalition of Concerned Businesses and Manufacturers of Canada. I'm very excited to be presenting our panel to you. Our panelists are Tim Egan, who is president of the Canadian Gas Association. We've got Dan McTeague, president of Canadians for Affordable Energy, Stephen Buffalo, president of the Indian Resource Council, and Michael Binnion, who's president of Quest Air Energy, which has holdings in Quebec, as well as the executive director of the Modern Miracle Network. So just to know how we're going to split this up tonight, we do have three segments. Our first segment is going to be talking about energy security and the energy industry's progress on how we're going to manage the geopolitical changes that are happening with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the impact that has on the world. Our second segment is going to be on our industry's progress towards net zero environmental goals, as well as other environmental goals. You'll learn actually that the industry is making incredible progress. And then finally, our third section will be discussing some of the other social issues, including First Nations reconciliation, as well as energy affordability and the carbon tax. We're going to have an opportunity for the audience to make comments and questions at the end of each segment. Now, let me just throw it over to Catherine Swift to say a few words of welcome, and she's going to moderate our first panel discussion about the growing need for more Canadian energy in the international world.
Thanks very much, Danielle, and welcome everyone. I was thinking prior to the panel this evening that I don't know that we could find a better time to be discussing these issues. Not only what's going on in the world, of course, all the massive disruptions we've seen, which are underpinned by what's happening in the energy sector, as well, of course, as what's happening here in Canada with announcements seemingly almost daily as to all manner of changes, forecast plans that are basically going to affect every Canadian and every Canadian business. So it's a very pivotal time for this kind of discussion, and I think the panel that's been assembled here is an excellent one to provide a number of different important perspectives on this very important issue. And as Danielle mentioned, the first topic that we want to speak to is the whole question of energy security. And I don't think energy security really got a whole lot of attention before the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine, because all of a sudden we're seeing exactly what a lack of energy security means. And it's extremely serious, extremely problematic. And it's changed a lot of these countries' approaches to their energy sector, and many of them are having to turn on a dime so that people can basically have the basic necessities of life. So I guess that's part of the issue that I'd like to put to the panel is what has the Russian invasion of Ukraine taught us about our reliance on hostile regimes effectively, and when we're dependent on them for something as essential as oil and natural gas. And of course, we all believe the world does need more Canadian energy, but of course, we've seen so many of our pipelines, of our natural gas projects canceled, delayed, blockaded, stopped in one way or another in recent years, which has, of course, reduced our ability to provide more of our energy to the world, unless we route it through the U.S., which is a pretty ham-handed way to be going about it. For example, there have been in LNG, liquid natural gas projects, 18 of them have been proposed, none have been completed. So very serious problems. And I think all Canadians would like to offer more support with our energy resources to the world. And how can we achieve that given what's happened in our infrastructure over the last number of years? So I'd like to turn to the panel, and I don't know who would like to attack the questions first. But maybe Tim, I'll ask you if you could give us some words of wisdom. Just cover that in 3 minutes or less.
Yeah, all right. So, well, just on that, thank you for inviting me. It's a delight to be here. But on your point about energy security, it's not something Canadians have ever really thought about, right? Because we're extraordinarily energy rich. Oil, gas, uranium, hydropower, wood, coal, right? We have a wealth of resources, all of the above. And so the current global energy security conversation comes to us as a prospective supplier to the world, not as someone whose own supply is ever threatened or has ever been threatened. Now, we've been a significant supplier of energy, principally to the United States, but to international markets with our exports for a long time. And within the gas industry, we're terribly excited about the opportunity to do something constructive to help our European allies in a moment of crisis. Now, as you pointed out, we don't have significant LNG export capacity. We do have a little bit on the West Coast operating right now, and we have a significant project under development that should be ready by the end of 2025. Another one or two projects that are close to an FID, a final investment decision. And so there are lots of prospective developments. What we can do right now is, again, as you noted, Catherine, we could export more gas into the United States. And that's actually significant. We still are the United States' largest supplier of natural gas. We are meeting as much as 15% of U.S. domestic supply through pipelines. We could be pushing more gas into the United States, which would facilitate more U.S. exports to the world. That's an immediate action we could take. But obviously, in the medium and long term, what we want to do is be able to export ourselves directly. And polling shows that Canadians are actually incredibly motivated by that opportunity, and they'd like to see Canada take action. So we're hoping that we can be cooperating with government on this point, and we can move projects forward more quickly so that we can help our European allies. Obviously, not in the immediate sense. That will require moving gas into the United States to do so. But in the medium to long term, because the geopolitics of energy, I think, have changed very fundamentally. They haven't changed for 6 months or 12 months. They've changed for the long term. And I think we're seeing lines drawn in the world. And frankly, we're on the side of the good guys, and we produce it better than anybody else does, and we should be exporting it.
Yeah, and you bring up some very interesting points in that currently our federal government is that the direction they're taking is actually very much diametrically opposed to those objectives. So, I mean, how do we get beyond the political opposition that has quite a bit of support? And maybe I could ask Stephen Buffalo to weigh in on this on the energy security issue as well, and how you see it from your perspective.
Thanks for the question, and first off, it's a great honor to be with these panelists here. Our communities, we seem to think that some transition needs to happen, but ultimately, depending where you go, the issue of energy security is probably not elevated yet, but it will be, because right now, like I know where I'm from, we do pay our elders heating bill, power bill, everything like that. So having that stability for our communities to at least see everyday life essentials is imperative. The system that we live under the Indian Act is just not working. Our communities, especially with the Indian Resource Council, have seen benefit from the oil and gas sector. They've invested millions of dollars in this sector. They have many people trained in this sector, and are prepared to come forward and to start being part of the solution. At one time, people and companies, I'm sure, governments looked at our communities as a variable. You don't know what you're going to get. But I think as we fast forward to now, you're seeing more of a constant that we definitely want to be part of what's happening to meet the needs of not only Canada, but, the world, now that it's in the forefront.
Yes, that's a very welcome perspective, I'm sure, for an awful lot of Canadians. And I think the one of the key issues right now that we do have is it possible within the even short to medium term to resurrect any of our proposals for, say, pipelines or other projects that have been put on the back burner, or maybe put right off the burners completely in recent years? Because really that is what we're going to have to see before we achieve the kind of role we can achieve in the world in terms of providing our energy. I don't know, Dan, if you would like to make some comments on that.
Well, it's astounding, and thank you for the invitation here. It's such a great group to be with. I watch them individually in their own fields, and amazing the work that they have done and how they excel. Being here is a treat for me, but I think for everybody, every Canadian that's out there today, a country that still imports 750,000 barrels of oil a day, having the third largest reserves in the world, having the ability to build out not only infrastructure, as we saw with Energy East, as we saw with Northern Gateway, as we've seen with the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. The ability for us to get our product to market is certainly there. But I think there has been a political lack of interest. I would say perhaps even a diversion away from what people have traditionally understood the role of government, and that's to ensure prosperity, to ensure that we do the best with our resources. It's not lost, I think, a lot of Canadians that what has made Canada attractive, despite its, for many people, inhospitable weather, we have created a nation which is second to none when it comes to the management of our various resources. My former riding in Pickering, the first nuclear commercial reactors in North America. It brought not just a new dimension of energy reality, it brought lower costs for a generation that attracted. Ontario was a magnet for many manufacturers. I'm probably going to go back into your field a little bit on this one, Catherine, but I think we've lost our way here. And there has perhaps been a narrative in this country that has said, yeah, we don't need infrastructure. We don't need to worry about the energy sector. And yet I think Canadians are now realizing once and for all that it's important to have that infrastructure. There's never been a better time for us to build out our pipelines. And if we don't do it, someone else will. And who is that someone? Venezuela, Iran, or Russia? I think Canadians are coming very quickly to the realization that it's a new day.
Well, we can hope so. It's been a big wake-up call in terms of what is happening in Europe, and yet we still see in Canada that we are effectively punishing ourselves, not only from an economic and business perspective, but for average consumers. In addition to that, and there has to be quite a significant sea change to change that direction. And I don't know, Michael Binnion, if you would like to weigh in on this broader issue of how do we provide better energy resources to the world?
Yeah, well, first of all, on the pipelines, for us to make the progress we need there on major infrastructure, I think it's a question of perspective of how we see ourselves as a country and as Canadians, and I think the war's help is focusing us there too. When I grew up, Canada was a place where I was proud to be a Canadian because we were a junior partner who punched above our weight, whether it was World War II or 1/10 the size of the United States, but still a member of the G7. It was something I was super proud of to be a Canadian, that we could be that contributor, always being counted to step in and do more than our share. But I think that's a 20th century view. I think in the 21st century, with what we've seen with resources and how important they are, and I think this is something we could easily have seen as an opportunity before this, and many of us have been talking about the opportunity for Canada to step up as a senior partner, no longer a junior partner, an actual senior partner as the reliable supplier of responsibly produced resources, not just oil and gas, softwood lumber, wheat, iron ore, nickel, anything that the world needs, Europe, America, Asia. And it's been an opportunity for us. I think what the war's done is shown us it's not just an opportunity it's now become an obligation. We have to now step up as that senior partner, that supplier of last resort for resources to keep the world safe. And I think it's now shown for Canadians and I think our leadership is trapped in the 20th century, this junior partner view. And I think it's time for us to step up and be senior partners in the world.
All right, we can take questions from the audience. If there's something that you heard that sparked your curiosity, or you want to do an observation, then just go up to the mic and we'll get you. But let me just run through the panel with an observation and get your comment on this. I'll ask each of you. Do you think that the federal government is recognizing the role that Canada can play? It's so strange to have seen in the last couple of months that you've got Quebec, for instance, canceling oil and gas leases and pledging that they're going to keep it in the ground. The Just Transition Task Force began talking about how to transition workers out of the energy sector. We don't have the same treatment of green bonds for nuclear and natural gas the way they do in Europe, but they just announced that they are going to give a significant tax credit for carbon technology. So I feel like we're getting a bit of a mixed message, but Michael, why don't I start with you? Because I know that you are desperately trying to do a project in Quebec, and I'm wondering if you're making some headway with the politicians and understanding the role we can play internationally, because exporting off the coast in Quebec makes the most sense to be able to help our European allies.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, just as a small anecdote, La Presse did an article shortly after the war started and said, well, Quebec can't do anything. How could Quebec possibly compete with Qatar, who's so much closer to the market? Bécancour and Saguenay, which are two, and Quebec City, all potential places for an LNG plant, they are 1/2 the distance as Qatar. I mean, this is grade 9 geography that La Presse couldn't get, right? We are way closer than the Louisiana Gulf Coast. Like, it is absolutely, we are, after Norway, we are, and Russia, we are absolutely the natural supplier to Europe. So this perception, as you talk about, and I really more and more, I think that we've got people trapped in a 20th century view of Canada, a 20th century view of the environment. I mean, this idea that the solution for the environment is to ban and block, I mean, that idea was 50 years ago. There's a lot of, you know, and I, by the way, there's a lot of great environmentalists, and you and I have talked to some who are really solutions oriented, looking forward, looking for new technologies. There's a lot of environmentalists who are stuck in the 20th century. They haven't had a new idea in 50 years.
All right. Let me ask Dan McTeague, because Dan, you mentioned that you used to be a representative with the Liberals, but you've broken with them in recent years on the policy positions that you've taken. Are you seeing any evidence that they're finally getting the important role that Canada needs to play in the world?
Completely detached. This would not have happened under Jean Chrétien, dare I say even Paul Martin. And I say that with some sadness, because there was a time in which you understood how global affairs was moving. Instead, we have a foreign minister who thinks it's more important to get involved in issues of censorship, as opposed to recognizing through trade and other opportunities that are there. To come back and see Minister Wilkinson saying, oh yeah, I'll get 300,000 barrels, and then some media grabbing it as if it was a great story, when in fact our potential was 10 times that amount. Look, I think for the Liberals, let's go a little closer to something that happened today. When you say you're going to drop emissions 42%, target the oil and gas sector, you've been able to get 1% in the past 10 years. How in goodness name are you going to do that in the next 7 years? Where are you going to get the $9 billion from? My guess is that this is really about virtue signaling. This is not about leadership. This is not about responsibility, because the crisis hasn't really hit them yet. Now, perhaps they know there's a crisis there. It's why they've jumped in bed with the NDP, and they've decided to hold on for dear life until 2025. But there is an awakening, as I mentioned earlier, in Canada. And the reality is that this government seems to be completely aloof and adrift from reality.
I remember the first time I heard the Liberals talk about natural gas being a potential solution. And it was Jim Carr, who was the Natural Resources Minister at the time. And he also talked about being able to displace coal in China with a lower emitting fuel of LNG, natural gas. And I felt like there was a bit of a breakthrough there. But Tim, you got to give us some hope. Do you think that we're seeing a reality check or reality set in, or is there still a lot of work to do?
So again, the last 5 weeks have fundamentally changed the conversation about energy, and even a few weeks into the war, you saw the federal government talking about the green agenda, and what Europe needed was green energy. In the last 2 weeks, you've seen them start to say green energy and LNG. So this is interesting. And so last week, the government signed a memorandum with the European Union to look at the green transition and LNG. It's very, thinly defined, shall I say, but they are talking about LNG. So I think there's a growing recognition, and Minister Wilkinson has made a couple of references in the last week or so. There's a growing recognition that, there's a serious problem here, and we actually can be part of the solution. So how they act on it, we'll wait and see. But as industry, we're stepping forward and we're saying, you know what? We're very keen to do this. We'll sit down with you. We'll pull the whole value chain together. We'll talk about what we can do now, what we can do in the near term and the midterm and the long term. Because to Michael's point, there's an enthusiasm and there's a technological skill level and an ability to do more, and we want to do it.
And I think it's a big thing for Stephen Guilbeault, with his background as president of ETHR, to come out and endorse carbon capture. So I think there's another example.
That is positive. Let me ask Stephen Buffalo, because 2 years ago, which feels like ages ago, the environmental community was standing in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs in opposing the Coastal GasLink line, We just saw recently that there was a major sabotage of the equipment there, $20 million. And I think that the public has a perception that Indigenous communities don't want to see this kind of development. And I'm wondering if you've begun to see a transition. You and I have been in discussions with and listened to Ellis Ross before as he talked about his journey from being anti-energy development to being pro-development. But is that a common story? Can you give us some idea?
You know, that dialogue is right across the country. And you know what? I think what we've discovered is that some of our people are hijacked, I'll say, by this environmental movement. And you know, it's a long rabbit hole that goes really deep. But for the most part, Indigenous communities are looking for prosperity. They're looking to get away from being controlled under the soft communism we call the Indian Act. You know, and every year that Alberta sends a transfer payment or somewhere, there's a small portion in that transfer payment for 643 First Nations in Canada who signed a comprehensive funding agreement with the federal government. That dependency since 2015 has increased, you know, and it's getting hard. So these projects and everything that's happening, the opportunities now, the door's open. The Supreme Court has decided, yes, we recognize rights, we recognize title. But, you know, there's a foreign influence that has come in to really try to stop this. And when you have people that have been impoverished and don't have a real source of income or what have you, and they're giving money to, here, you go stop this, you go and protest this pipeline or what have you, it happens. And that it really hurts, but it's something that our good friend Vivian Krause, Dr. Vivian Krause, has opened my eyes to it. And at some point, you know, we have to be accountable to what's happening because the national interests are at stake here. And our people, First Nations people, are still stuck in this paradigm where we're down here, where everyday Canadian is up here.
Thanks for that, Stephen. Go ahead, Michael, and then
Yeah,
we'll
well,
take a question.
We're just on that. But one thing that would be nice is Stand.Earth and these other groups. Would you also be willing to talk to the 16 First Nations along the coast who are owners of the pipeline today?
Exactly. Great point. We've got a question from Peter LaFontaine. Peter.
Hi. Thanks very much for pulling this together. And my question is, given our ESG standards in Canada, we do it extremely well. We're getting better, possibly faster than everybody else in the world. We're also seeing the Liberal NDP group now double down on the carbon tax. Sounds like they're going to go from $40 to $170, which is having enormous inflationary effect on the average Canadian. Our electric bills could potentially go to where Germany is, which is 5 times. My big question is why? Why is Ottawa not seeing this? Like, what is it that they've missed or I've missed, or how is that? What's happening? And I guess, Dan, maybe you and Stephen, thank you very much for showing up.
Thanks for that, Peter. And you set us up well to transition into our next segment on environmental issues and our path to net zero, how we're doing, can we get there? So let me put it to Dan, just wondering about what is the big driver? How can we be looking at these huge trends that Peter pointed out and still have the federal government not seeing it? What's going on ideologically?
I think it's an excellent question. I don't think people have felt it, at least up until very recently. It's easy to say, hey, we're going to hit you with a carbon tax. It won't have any effect. You get a big fat rebate. 80% of you will get more than you actually wound up paying. That was actually up until last Thursday when the parliamentary budget officer corrected that and said that's not true. There is I think their word, net loss to most Canadians. I suspect that now it's getting real. Not only are people seeing higher energy prices, and I'm not just talking gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, et cetera, home heating fuel, especially in places that tend to be extraordinarily vulnerable. The Maritimes. Tomorrow morning, I'll do a couple of interviews in Newfoundland to talk about why they're still paying over $2.25 for home heating fuel. This is a province that doesn't have natural gas. This is a province that would love to have more electricity, has to get the federal government to bail out the $5 billion for the Muskrat Falls. But I digress. The reality is that for most people, it's coming real. The rebates are falling short. This is having a cascading effect throughout the economy. And we can all agree or disagree about energy and energy prices. But when you start messing with food prices, you're into a different political climate.
Stephen, what do you think is happening there? What's the ideology?
It's really tough to say, but I'll tell you one thing. like our First Nations weren't ever consulted in this whole space, this whole paradigm, and that's where I'm stuck. I'm stuck at that point that we're not at the table to talk about this. You know, under the treaties, you know, I always go back to that. You know, and I'll always raise that flag. Is, you know, we gave up this much of the land. Underneath, we're saying is ours. So we should have had a say in what was going on. And now that these governments are imposing these new policies and restrictions, it's handcuffed us even to that point. And getting out of it, I don't know. I'm having a hard time seeing a way out of this for First Nations people, just because what government implements. You know, this is how they operate. Bill 69 came here to Calgary to First Nations, but they did not consult with any of the First Nations in Alberta. They brought in communities from different parts of Canada, from BC, from Ontario, everyone who agreed with that political agenda to have Bill C-69. So we crashed it. You know, I brought our members in, and we put our our foot forward, and we forcibly said, "You're not consulting with us at all. You know, you're taking one side, and you're now putting that check mark that First Nations agree with AFN and with the federal government on Bill C-69," when we said that's not true. So it's a tough fight. You know, and to be honest, the IRC doesn't have the resources to keep fighting.
All right, that sounds like a plug.
That's a commercial.
If only you could do more development on First Nations, then you'd be able to generate plenty of money. Now, here's what I'm going to do: is we're going to do the next round, going into the discussion about environmental sustainability. Catherine, I'm going to take the first stab at questions of our panel, but once I've gone through the first round of questions, I'll throw to you, and you can do the second round of questions, and then we'll go to the audience. So let me start off by telling you my bias. I've done a number of segments on this in the last year on the issue of net zero. And as soon as Europe went down the path of saying that net zero was the goal, I thought, we got this, we can do this. We can use carbon technology and be able to capture it and store it underground, or capture it and use it for useful purposes, or we could offset using the green mechanism for the transfer in the Paris Agreement. So I've been very enthusiastic about it, but I may be alone on this. So I don't want to let my enthusiasm overshadow just the incredible amount of work that needs to be done to actually get to net zero. Michael has in the past told me that net zero means different things to different people, and so I want to put it to him the question of, is net zero for the energy sector achievable? And give us your sense of what it is that you think you can do. Plus, I need you to talk a bit about your project in Quebec, because you've proposed it as a net zero project. I love it as a potential showcase for two Quebecers about what is possible and what can be done. And I want to know what it is and why you're having trouble getting that one put forward.
Well, I'm happy to address both of those things, and the rest of the panelists, you might as well just leave them. I want to make one quick thing. I published Canada's very first paper on carbon leakage, and I did it because there wasn't one, and it's a travesty that this government put in a tax, and it's not carbon pricing, it's a tax without studying carbon leakage. And carbon leakage just basically means you put a tax here, the jobs and emissions go somewhere else, right? And so I just want to make the quick comment that I'm in favor of incentivizing people to reduce emissions, not penalizing people for heating their homes and commuting to work. And I think we can do that with carbon pricing or with the US approach of incentives. The current excise tax on fuel is just a terrible policy. So with that, I'll answer your question now. Okay, so I think I'll just talk to the one point. What I think a lot of people don't understand is that hydrocarbons are decomposed plant fat. I mean, plankton, maybe decomposed animal plants, but small animals and algae and so on and so forth. So it literally is nature's solution. The plants grow, the plant fat decomposes, it turns into oil and gas. We put it back in the atmosphere, and Mother Nature's extremely good at recycling this. It's extremely good. Not so good that it's keeping up with the amount of emissions that we put into the air now. But the point I'm talking about, the carbon, just to make the point about organic chemistry, is it's really cool and it's really well understood. You can take CH4 molecules, a gas molecule, you break it apart, energy comes out, carbon dioxide comes out, water comes out. You can take the carbon dioxide and the water, if you put energy in, they go back together. In nature, the energy is from the sun. No reason why you can't do it in a plant and have an energy source from somewhere else. So I've had panels, Danielle's been with me, dozens and dozens of different technologies where you can, in a plant, take CO2 and water and turn it into really interesting stuff. alcohols, industrial alcohols, consumer alcohols, industrial products, calcium carbonate, magnesium carbonate, carbon black, carbon pitch, carbon nanotubes, all kinds of cement additives. The list is endless what you can do with it. We can today, if we choose to afford it, capture and recycle all the CO2. It's a cost. There's a cost. But the technology is known. We can do it. It's just a cost. So this idea of, the path to net zero, for me, I think for oil and gas, it can be completely sustainable if we choose it to be sustainable. And I think we've reached a point where people are willing to, as I say, we're now putting a deposit on the can of Coke. When I was a kid, we didn't recycle tin cans. Today we do, right? Put a deposit on the can of Coke, put a deposit on and this is where I think true carbon pricing is better than what we're doing with our taxes here. But put a deposit on the ton of CO2, and I think you're going to find all kinds of amazing new technologies come out. Some of them are already out that's going to recycle the CO2. So I'll stop there.
I'm going to ask you a little bit later to talk about your Quebec project, because I would love to see that one go ahead. But let me go to Tim and get Tim to comment on this as well. So you've heard Michael's answer. He did talk about cost. As long as we have the money to do this, anything is possible. And I think we've got brilliant minds and entrepreneurs who can do it. So give me your sense of how achievable this aggressive target is of net zero by 2050, and how achievable is it for the oil and gas sector in particular?
So can I answer that depends?
Sure.
So that depends. People talk about net zero in these sort of absolute terms, and that's a massive transformation of an economy as a whole. And it has profound effects on the price because, as Michael says, it's about spending money. So there's a massive effect on the price of energy, has a massive effect on the reliability of energy, has a massive impact on energy security. And so, the focus for us, because I run a trade association in the natural gas industry, many of my member companies have made commitments to net zero, and they laid out different pathways for how they're going to get there. But the biggest challenge always is, do people appreciate how much this is going to cost? And do they appreciate the kind of timelines that government is proposing? We have reduced, as Dan said, roughly 1% of our emissions in the last 15 years, and we're proposing to reduce 40% in the next 10 years. That's 40 times the reduction rate in half the time frame in a difficult economic environment. I think those are pretty tall targets, and I think there should at least be a realistic conversation about what this is going to cost people. Because ultimately, the consumer Canadian consumers are very enthusiastic about reducing emissions. And we've got all kinds of very creative, innovative technology that we've been developing in the gas industry and in other sectors as well. So there are all sorts of neat things we can do. But again, people need to know what this is going to do to their bill. Because in my experience, when you focus group these things with people, they're all for it, and then you start telling them how much it's going to cost them. And the enthusiasm starts to wane pretty quickly, right? And we need to be honest with the public about this. And I'm not convinced that we're being entirely honest with the public.
Okay, I know Dan's going to give us some brutal honesty, but before we get the downer view, I'm going to talk to Stephen for a minute about some of the projects that you're seeing on First Nations. Because one of the things I've just been so amazed and overwhelmed by is that I think we're seeing a real economic reconciliation that is happening with First Nations communities, and that a lot of these projects do have that environmental element to it and do have carbon technology as an element to it. Can you just give us some of the examples of what you're seeing and hearing?
Yeah, like, for example, one of our biggest producer, Frog Lake First Nation, they've gone their own way in trying to do a carbon project up there, and it's pretty big. And the cogen that they're involved in, we helped with the AIOC, the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corp. They're trying to lead the way in that capacity, but again, they're against some really big players in that space. But to reach net zero, I'll tell you, it's tough being an Indian in this space, because I see it in two fronts. Science is one thing, and that's Western way of thinking. And then the other side is, well, from science, we need CO2. We need CO2 for reclamation. We need CO2 for plants. Growing up, my grandfather taught me, watch the ducks. They'll tell you when things are happening. I just heard an elder the other day tell me he was told to watch the trees. They need carbon. and now we're trying to take it away. So, I come from a place, Samson Cree, and in Cree we say Nipsikopa, and that basically means land of the willows. You see how fast willows grow. And now we're offsetting balance. You know, some of the things we're doing, we're offsetting balance. And that's hard for me on one side of my brain, but the other side is the scientific thought and the Western thinking. So how do I balance that? It's tough. To get to net zero, I don't think we will. You know, I think it'll always be that 20, 30% where that'll linger. But I don't know. It's your prime minister will make that decision for us.
Thanks for that, Stephen. Okay, so you don't think that it is possible to reach net zero. Let me hand it off to Dan, and I want to get your answer on the two fronts. Can we achieve net zero by 2050? And if so, what will it cost? Or what are the trade-offs there? I think a few people have made reference to it. You've looked at these numbers. What do you think?
I don't think it's possible, and assuming we're doing it alone, it's a big consideration because other countries have to be in there as well. I'm not saying we're shirking our responsibility, because that's, of course, the answer you get when you point this out. I suspect that one of the paths that is most discussed is electrification. That somehow you can have 80% of your country, electrify overnight or over a period of time. There are some extraordinarily impractical and implausible feats in accomplishing that. In my province, of course, I mentioned nuclear earlier. How much would it cost to build, another 4 nuclear facilities in Ontario so that everybody can drive around in an EV, assuming that's the metaphor for getting to that net zero? I don't think the country has the trillions of dollars to be able to do this. And at the end of the day, what does it achieve? Apart from impoverishing the country, not using it for the proper reasons, as Michael has quite pointed out, where there are a tremendous number of economic opportunities. I just don't think it's practical. And when you put this under closer scrutiny, you recognize that going it alone, as we are in this country, is a recipe for economic ruin.
Michael, yeah, go ahead.
So I have a different view, and my view is if we change our paradigm to realize if you make sustainable hydrocarbons part of how you're going to get to net zero, I think it suddenly becomes very possible and probably a lot faster than people realize. And I think the reason we get stuck into you can't get to net zero is because we buy into the idea the only way to do it is with windmills and solar. Well, then you can't. I agree. You won't ever get there. It's ridiculous. But if we start to look and say, well, what about sustainable hydrocarbons? Like, what if we actually start to take responsibility for the emissions from the oil, make them a permanent part of our energy diet, because we will capture, recycle, turn them into useful products? I think we can get there and probably a lot faster than people realize.
Okay, Michael, you're just going to have to briefly talk about the vision that you had for your project in Quebec so people know what that would look like.
Oh, yeah. Well, such a disappointment for me, right? So what happened to us in Quebec, of course, is we were the very first mega project in Canada that was canceled in 2011. It's a 20 TCF discovery. It's enough to keep Quebec in natural gas for 100 years, or to make them an exporter to Europe today, for example, with a port that's twice as close as Qatar, as it turns out. So anyways, we ran to the environmentalists, and it challenged us that we realized we were not going to be allowed to produce that project using the way business as usual. And so I spent a lot of time looking for other alternatives. And the first thing we did is, well, could we produce natural gas with zero emissions? And when I first heard the idea, it's ridiculous. But then it was somebody here in Calgary talking about it, so that's ridiculous. Anyways, I said, okay, well, prove that she's wrong. And I found I couldn't, because with hydroelectricity, modern SCADA control, vapor recovery, we can produce with near zero, like not literally zero, but near zero emissions. We can produce the natural gas in Quebec with zero emissions, and we could do it today. We've got the engineering plans for it. Well, that was 3 years ago, and the ENGOs immediately came back and says, well, that doesn't count. It's only 20% of the emissions. The consumption's the real problem. I said, well, you haven't been telling me that up until now. So I said, okay, if I didn't think the first was possible, why can't we do consumption with zero emissions? So let's go prove that wrong. Well, it turns out we can do that too. So we took the plan to say and it's a hub. We would put a CO2 line and a natural gas line in the same thing. We'll send the gas to the industrial park, capture the CO2, send it back to us. But we were also going to put pilots for cement additives, blue hydrogen in that same industrial park so that we could recycle some of the CO2 there. Anything that we couldn't come back to us, we would store it. As it turned out, literally on the same well pad that we produced from, there was storage underneath. So it was a literal circular economy project. And so all of that then came down to, in a hub, we could produce and consume the natural gas, and the consumption would also be near zero because we'd either recycle or recapture and store all the emissions. So that was the final proposal. We've actually put it in front of the government. We put that project actually in front of the government when they announced they were going to ban it. We said, okay, well here's the engineer's not quite finished, but here it is. We think we can do it. And of course they're saying they're gonna ban it anyways. But that's why I'm optimistic. And by the way, the cement additives, we think they can make money at about 10, 20, maybe 10, 20 bucks. That's 5% of the world's emissions, cement. It's a concrete. So we think that can make money at 5 to 10 bucks. The blue hydrogen, for sure, under 100 bucks. Some of the capture and storage might need 150, but there's a lot of that works at today's prices of carbon. That's why I think it's closer than we realize, but only if we accept the idea that it's going to be sustainable hydrocarbons. 80% of our energy system can remain. That's how we're going to get to net zero.
All right, let me hand it over to Catherine. If I've missed anything on the environmental discussion, why don't I let you pose some questions to the panel?
Well, I think one thing that has been alluded to a few times, but maybe not pursued, and it's something that's always kind of bedeviled me about this whole debate, is that the gung-ho environmental activists are always wanting to rush ahead with these goals, and we're not supposed to question the science. We're not. You almost feel like you're really being sold a bill of goods. and initially, when our economy was perhaps in better shape, when we didn't have a turmoil around the world that we have now, and so on, I think a lot of people did buy into this agenda. But now the price is coming due, and Dan, you've alluded to it a little bit. Tim, you have as well. And how do we get the facts out there? This is something that I have found just exasperating. We know young people are very gung-ho on the green movement and so on. They're not yet realizing that one of the reasons they won't be able to buy a house, for example, or one of the reasons their lifestyle is going to be significantly different is going to be if we continue to pursue these goals. And part of it too, a lot of the international experts, the Bjorn Lomborg crew and those folks, and I think, Michael, you sort of alluded to this a little bit with what you said, was technology and adaptation is going to get us there, not punishing policies like the announcements that were made today that we're suddenly going to reduce our emissions by 42% in 8 years, which is absurd by anybody's estimation. How do we get the real story across so that people buy into the right agenda, I guess? Because again, we've all debated to a certain extent, what does net zero mean? You get into ESG, and when you see suddenly, in my long history in public policy, when you see any policy that lines the pockets of consultants to the extent that ESG has done already, and it'll be way worse in the next number of years, that's a bad policy. Because suddenly it's so complicated and so messy, you're suddenly paying all these consultants. And this is money that could go to useful projects, like, that actually accomplish something on the emissions side, not just into the pockets of these people that are supposedly advising businesses as to how to conform to these complex issues. How do we get the real story out there? It's a huge challenge.
Let's get Tim to take that one on. How do you communicate the message? And I think it's a good point, especially to young people, because I think anyone who was born after the first Earth Day, which is anybody who's now, I guess, 50 years old and younger, have a very strong sense that we need to do to protect the environment. And the message on energy has been so negative. How would we turn that around, Tim?
Well, first of all, I think one of the challenges we have is that we've been so extraordinarily successful with energy systems in Canada, right? Everything works. You turn on the light switch, you get electricity. You turn up the thermostat, you get heat. You turn up on the ignition, your car starts and runs. And, think back to your grandparents' generation, for most of us, and it was a remarkably different situation, right? And so we've become spoiled by the extraordinary effectiveness of the system we have. So that's a great challenge. And this is going to be especially a challenge for young people who, quite frankly, are educated in a system which has convinced them that we're in a state of constant peril, right? So responding to that as a lobbyist for the oil and gas industry rarely comes off well, right? So I think we have to think about how we're communicating, as you say, and one of the best ways to communicate, to pick up on your point, Catherine, is there's no substitute for having to pay a bill, right? So when people start to see a bill, Let's face it, the enthusiasm tends to wane a bit when they see what's happening on costs. But I think what we have to do as an energy industry is pick up on some of the ideas that Michael's talking about. And that is, you know what, this is actually an incredibly exciting industry that's doing really, really neat things in the environment in all kinds of ways. The technological innovations we're delivering are extraordinary. And then put that in the global context. When you think about the fact that there are 1 billion people who don't have access to the very basic energy services, there are 2 billion who don't have access to the regular use of electricity. We could be delivering to meet their needs using the resources we have and building on the culture we have of continuous improvement in the use of these resources. And I think that's something that's attractive to young people. And I think that's the kind of messaging we need to communicate. And dare I say it with Stephen Buffalo on the panel, that we should be thinking about that in the first instance with our own First Nations communities, right? And pick up on Stephen's points about the affordability of energy and the challenges that First Nations are communicating. We should be focused on that in the first instance and then taking that to the world.
So let's throw it to Stephen and talk. What is the better message on the environment if our industry is approaching First Nations communities? Because there's obviously been some missteps in the past. What is a better message? What needs to be done in the future?
Yeah, looking forward, our message has always been balance, protect the environment, and obviously business and economic development. And sometimes, most times than not, industry and government has decided on a path, without talking to the local people. We did this panel one year with when Michael first brought me to the oilmans in Banff, and Ellis Ross said, when he talked about the LNG, he said, we gave, was it TC Energy, 5 different spots to have the terminal, but they chose theirs. And look, local knowledge of the ocean and the coast, they wouldn't listen. Going forward though, we have to give me $1 million. No.
Well, that's twice you pitched for money there, Stephen.
Well, the truth is, we're not telling the world. We're not telling even our own Canadians that, what we're doing is positive. I just learned so much just listening to Michael just a couple of seconds ago on the capture and everything that goes with the pricing beside it. We're not saying that story. I'm watching the Stanley Cup playoffs last year, and I see a commercial on eco justice. I'm watching the golf tournament a couple of years back, eco justice. We're not taking our steps into that mainstream and at least having to say something that we're trying to be balanced in all this development. Of course we want to protect the environment. We want to protect the earth. But in the same sense, we can't just be stagnant and let this stuff all happen. And then now everyone's going to be paying through the nose on everything. And First Nations aren't ready for that because we don't got no money.
Thanks for that, Stephen. Michael, I wonder if you can, because you've educated both Stephen and I on your projects and net zero. And one of the great insights that you had for me was that you can't get net zero on solar power until all of the components that go into solar power are net zero. You can't get net zero on wind turbines until all of the components that go into wind turbines are net zero. And I wouldn't mind if you'd explore that a little bit, because I think it's such an insight, because everyone just says, oh, well, we'll just green the grid, we'll do nothing but wind and solar and batteries, and somehow that will eliminate fossil fuel use. And it's not quite true.
No. Well, first of all, just the insight I just had right now, if Steve Buffalo had $1 million, he'd be rich. So yeah, well, this is the interesting thing. I mean, I was talking about before to somebody that a windmill is a unit of hydrocarbons in for 3 units of wind out. Like, how do you build a windmill? Like you can't build a windmill with a windmill, right? And the wind is renewable, but those windmills not so much. And the same thing with the sun's renewable. The solar panels not so much. Like, look at what happens to them at the end of their life. And find me a solar park that has lasted 25 years yet. I mean, maybe they will one day, but they certainly haven't yet, and neither have windmill parks, right? The fundamental problem with the alternative energy is that we're in a world with more people, growing number of people, higher demand for energy. We should be trying to dematerialize. We should be trying to use less land, less stuff per unit of energy, and wind and solar go the opposite direction. They have a fundamental problem. I think that when I talk about the technology advances that's happening for oil and gas, I have no doubt this is going to happen in wind and solar too. But trust me, they need to. This idea that wind and solar's technology is ready for prime time yet, it's not. But I'm optimistic it will be ready, just like I'm optimistic oil and gas is going to be able to bring our emissions to zero. But let's be clear, they're not ready yet.
Okay, we're going to have Dan McTeague give an answer on this one. take a quick audience question. Then we're going to take a brief pause because one of our guests, Tim Egan, has another event that he's got to get to tonight. So Dan, why don't you tell us the communication message? How do we break through to young people, or what do you think is the best argument on the environment to support more energy development?
I think young people are engaged, whether we have that argument or not, or how we try to explain to them where we're going. But I think we haven't done a very good job at communicating. I mean, I've just heard guests here say some extraordinary, powerful things. Lucid as they may be, the reality is, I think, for many, we don't really appreciate what our potential is. And I think for that reason, although we are blessed with an abundance of energy, we also recognize the great possibilities with technology. Canada can be a leader in the world, perhaps in a different way, but to use an old expression, not all wisdom is new wisdom. There are some things that we've done extraordinarily well. Think of nuclear and now using that in the context of small nuclear modular reactors. Think of the use of natural gas to propel the next generation of hydrogen. When you talk to younger people about these things, you see the lights go on. And it's not just about affordability. It's really about, that's the kind of future I want. The question is, does your future in Canada really lead to that kind of conclusion? Do we have a Canada that shows promise of the future? I think it does. But I think we have to end this battle between environment versus affordability, big oil versus those with alternative ideas.
Yeah, great comments. Deidre, and got some applause there on that one. Deidre, go ahead.
Hi, thank you everybody for this very insightful panel discussion. It's nice to hear your wisdom. So prior to today's announcement from the federal government to release their plan for emissions reductions, the Net Zero Advisory Board wanted to set legally binding targets of 40 to 45% reductions by 2030 for oil and gas. And any of their correspondence states that it's just a foregone conclusion that oil and gas is going to miss the targets, resulting in the need for penalties for our industry. But what if we actually achieve those targets, or we exceed them, and we're able to share those innovations and technological learnings with other sectors that are able to reduce their emissions? Then what rewards or incentives would be appropriate to continue incentivizing the oil and gas industry to move forward with technology?
All right, Tim, why don't you take that question?
Well, the biggest incentive for anybody who's developed a new technology is to allow them to develop that technology and take it to market, because they're going to do very well in the market, because everybody wants the technologies. They're going to deliver on the environmental improvements and the efficiency gains and so on. So, sometimes in the conversation, there seems to be this assumption that a market can't deliver on the environmental benefits we want. And in fact, I think a market is the best single driver to achieve the environmental benefits we want. So, to your point, and the government was very, very clear today, they did not set a cap. They did not set explicit targets, right? They were definitive about that. And so they differed from the direction of the Net Zero Advisory Committee, and maybe at a future date they will make those more firm. But I think they differed because they recognized the challenge of doing that and the challenge that would impose. But again, go into the oil and gas industry and just take a look at the extraordinary innovation that's underway. We created a natural gas innovation fund in the Canadian Gas Association. We've invested in over 50 technologies. These are startup companies that are keen as anything to bring new ideas into the market, from production to end use. And there are a whole host of cool ideas. They don't need any additional incentive, right? Because if these ideas are going to work, they're going to succeed and make money and, drive these companies forward and drive our economy forward. And I think Canada can lead on that. The challenge is, are we leading, as Michael says, by seeing oil and gas as part of the solution? Or are we seeing it as a problem that we somehow need to put aside? And if it's the latter, then, that's like, you're destroying your own assets. And why would you do that? That's not serving the interests of the country.
Let me get Michael to get the last word on this before we take a quick break. So you've said that our energy industry could get to net zero. We can get there faster than anyone else. And if we do have a huge amount of technology that can be monetized. But can it be done in some of the timeframes that are being proposed?
Yeah, well, when I grew up in Calgary, there was only 400,000 people here, right? There's 1.2 million people here today. They all have bigger houses. They drive more cars per person. So if you had said in 1970 to somebody that in 2020, there's going to be 1.2 million people here, all with bigger houses and driving more cars, and the air and water would be cleaner. They would have thought you were crazy, but it happened. And I have to tell you, like, it's only that, you know, some similar amount of time from then to now is from now till 2050. And I don't know, like, to Dan and Tim's point, is society and people willing to pay the cost to get to net zero? But here's what I'm sure of. Oil and gas can get there cheaper and faster than wind and solar.
Love it. All right, so we're going to take a quick pause. We're going to say goodbye to Tim Egan, who is the president of the Canadian Gas Association. When we return, we'll jump off this point about affordability. How much is it going to cost? Do stay with us. We'll be right back. I'm Danielle Smith, and this is a presentation by the News Forum.
I'm Nima Rajan, and this is the Forum Daily. Join us for our daily news program that brings you the biggest stories of the day from Canada and around the world. The Forum Daily gives you the facts on the issues that matter to Canadians to help you stay informed in an ever-changing world. Join me weekdays for the Forum Daily, 6 p.m., 7:30 p.m., 9 p.m., and 11 p.m. Eastern, right here on the News Forum Network.
All right, welcome back. I'm Danielle Smith. My co-host is Catherine Swift, and this is a News Forum production. We're talking about why the world needs more Canadian energy. Our first panel discussion was about energy security. Our second panel discussion was about environmental issues, in particular net zero. Our last one, and we've touched on it a little bit already, is the issue of affordability, as well as some of the issues around, we talk about ESG, that's an acronym we've used before. It means environmental, social, and governance. We don't spend a lot of time talking about the social advantage that Canadian energy has, and we're going to get into that a little bit on this panel, especially as we talk about Indigenous involvement in projects, as well as the energy affordability piece. So I'll turn it over to Catherine, and she can lead this initial round of discussion, and then we'll do some audience Q&A. Catherine, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we need to have a little more talk about ESG. It's got a lot of momentum right now. We know in Canada, virtually, well, all of our financial institutions, virtually all large corporations have signed on to this regime. I thought right from the get-go, it's actually based on false pretenses, because of course it's supposedly based on the fact that if you didn't have something like ESG to impose on companies, what they would be doing was merely seeking as much money as they could make and so on. And yeah, money's important, of course, for everybody. But when you look at successful businesses that are successful over the long term, they're already doing things that fulfill those types of criteria because their customers demand it, their shareholders demand it. And this has been the case for decades. This isn't a new thing. And I guess what bothers me about ESG, well, there's a lot of things that bother me about ESG, but I think part of it is it's a system that can be gamed, as we are starting to see the so-called greenwashing we hear about, where even some of the biggest proponents, some of the big companies that Mark Carney's advising, have been accused of greenwashing, for example. In other words, faking that they're fulfilling ESG goals. It's as I mentioned earlier in the discussion, anything that's lining so many consultants' pockets that they're growing. That's a massively growing sector. Suggests it's a bad policy, because that's not productive money in the economy. So I'm just interested in the panel's take on ESG and how they see that evolving, because it's got so much momentum right now. It's going to take an awful lot I think to get to a realistic regime, not the current one where a lot of people are making a lot of money but imposing constraints on businesses that simply aren't accomplishing the objectives. How about Dan, for starters?
Oh, thanks. This, if you'd asked anybody just a couple of years ago, in fact, you speak to Canadians today, they still won't know what ESG is. But for maybe 5-7 years ago, it wasn't well understood. And the broader understanding is that this is the new way in which, the kaleidoscope in which we perceive our investments. And those investments now have to meet a certain standard, a certain criteria. I think it's not a disservice to Canada. Actually, I think it's actually good for our oil and gas sector and ultimately for consumers. I say that because I think we ace it on social. Now, Steve and I will probably disagree on this, but I'll let him talk about it. And we definitely ace it on governance. again, comparing our other countries that have the kind of resources that we have, it doesn't take a great amount of lecture to understand that Canada has a significant advantage. We need to work harder on the environmental side, and we need to be in a position where we can perceive this. The danger for me becomes one of when we say to everybody, we have organizations around the world that Canada is a bad place to invest. We've seen the devolution, we've seen the divestment strategy, and Canada, being the nice nation that it is, willing to bend over backwards for just about everybody, has unfortunately become a bit of a victim of its own kindness. And it's for that reason that I think we have to be very careful about those who are, you mentioned Mark Carney, the same Mark Carney is now saying because of the way we're moving in terms of ESG and our willingness to walk away from oil and gas, we're talking 10 years of inflation. I think he was putting back his banker hat on and saying, I don't like what I'm seeing, because he knows it's not transitory. At the end of all of this, I think it comes down to, do we want the rest of the world to tell us how we do our business, or do we want to be able to tell the rest of the world how we do our best business when it comes to ESG and when it comes to oil and gas? And I think if we say that, and our politicians, especially those who are prancing around the world and giving various speeches to various forums around the world, were to actually come out and say, hey, we're not perfect, but we're one of the best. You need us more than we need you. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I worked for prime ministers who did that in the past. Not all of them, but to be sure, I think you have a very captive audience internationally. ESG, I think, is probably going to have to take a bit of a pause. That's my opinion.
But I think, Dan, you just put your finger on it. Is our own government is inviting the criticism. It indeed is initiating a lot of the criticism of our own businesses here in Canada. Instead of boosting the positive, they're actually focusing on a lot of the negative and encouraging these types of things that are so punitive to Canada.
Look, there's no doubt. I worked in foreign affairs. I represent this country in foreign affairs. There's nothing like going to an international forum, swilling back a bit of Perrier and having canapes and having pull-asides and speaking on the margins. You don't want to be out of step with whatever the current de rigueur ideas are, but you have to represent your country. And this is a failure, I think, in leadership in this country. And I'm not being political. It's just, to me, I've never seen a prime minister, certainly of my political stripe, acting the way this man has behaved.
Yeah, when we're beating ourselves up, we're pretty much inviting others to join in. Yeah, Michael, what is your take on the whole ESG regime as it sits right now?
Yeah, well, I don't disagree with what was just said, but I'll just give another perspective, I guess. So I've had the theory for a little while, and it's probably because I spent so much time in Quebec listening to people tell me everything that was wrong with the way we do things, is that we've had a bit of a problem, at least in Alberta and in the oil and gas industry in particular, in not getting that the customer's always right. And I think there's a part of that because we never meet a customer. I mean, nobody leaves Calgary to go to Chicago and say, please buy my gas because it's bluer or it's cheaper, because it's not. It's not bluer and it's not cheaper. It's the exact same gas. So we end up, as I say, a little bit in a bubble in Calgary or in the oil and gas industry with this magic pipeline concept that I put oil and gas into pipeline and magically money comes out, and it works the other way on the other end, right? You put money in and magically oil and gas comes out. So it's absolutely magic. You never meet each other. And of course, down in Quebec, you start to meet people. And there's been a bit of an attitude, I think, in our industry, and I think it's changing, but there's been a bit of an attitude, they need us. It's our job to just get it out as cheaply as possible and make sure the system works, like Tim Egan was talking about, the system works. And it's worked extremely well for a long time. But there are people at the other end of that pipeline, which I remind people, some of them are at the end of my block. Like the other end of the pipeline is the nurse living at the end of my block also, right? And they want to feel better about the oil and gas that they use. And the way they're going to feel better is that feels more environmentally responsible. And we as an industry, I think, have been late to recognize the customer's always right, and we need to work to make them feel better. And I think it's partly because we've never met them. Like one of the things I always say, GM doesn't sell you a car and say, good luck with that. Right? They create a life of product relationship with you on the basis that if they do, you might buy another one. Well, we quite literally tell people, well, here's your oil and gas, good luck with it. Like, good luck with that climate change problem thing, and good luck. We don't even know what you do with it. We don't care what you do with it. So I think that's a change we need to make. And ESG, I think, has some elements that maybe could allow us to do that. I
think getting to the broader issue of affordability, I think I know one thing from the organization that I represent here is that there are huge energy affordability problems in Canada right now, whether it's electricity, whether it's fossil fuels, and it's driving businesses out of the country. That's a serious problem. And it is the one issue that is top of mind for many, many of these. And these are manufacturing businesses that offer excellent jobs that are the kind of firms that governments tell us they want to keep here. And yet our policies are doing exactly the reverse. And I know, Stephen, you initially were talking about, how economic opportunity is being foregone in many of your communities for exactly the same reason. So I wonder if you could maybe address that from your perspective.
I'm really trying to follow how you're asking me this question, but I can't help but think of the responses on this issue of ESG. It is something that it's at different levels. For me, for example, being an Indigenous person on a board is one thing. But as far as the participation in actually an investment owner in the big project is another thing. That says a scale of different. There's a wide variety there. It is very difficult to see our progress in it, because what I'm seeing is it gets turned on and off. Like right now, in some of the areas in Canada, some of our communities do not have clean water to drink. And we're still saying, yes, ESG, yeah, we're including everybody, but in hindsight, is it just a fad? I don't know. The proof is in the pudding. But I think we've done a lot of good things since we've heard that terminology, and I know for the fact that a lot of the communities, they see projects in their territory, and they want to have a say. Some of it's good, some of it's bad, but at the end of the day, majority of them, they want to get out of this realm that we're in under the Indian Act, and how it all ties together. We need leaders like Michael. Michael came up to me one time and said, "I want you to speak at this conference. We need to bridge this gap." And I kind of just like, sure, whatever. But he's true to his word. He spoke at a conference that we had in 2016. I had Indigenous people, including my dad, come up to me and say, "Is that guy for real?" It's absolutely. The messaging that's coming, that we're working now together, to me, that's true ESG. That's once we're progressing together, holding hands, walking down the railway track, he's on one beam, I'm on the other beam, and we're going together. We'll go a lot further to doing that than trying to do by ourselves, trying to balance on the railway track.
It's amazing, actually, I think, what's happened since 2016, because that was, at that point in time, nobody was talking about true equity sharing in pipeline projects or projects generally. There was a lot of joint ventures, but there was not real what I would call with revenue sharing, job sharing, and equity sharing. And Steve and I together, I was the first person to speak at a Gridlock conference at a First Nations group. Stephen always calls it was like a bad sock op with the white people on one side and the First Nations on the other. But it was a start, and he was the first First Nation that came to speak at Canadian Energy Executives. This all happened in 2016, and it was really with this commitment that we would lead energy executives in Calgary into this genuine job sharing, genuine revenue sharing, genuine equity sharing, and that First Nations would be able to trust that and say, well, we can partner with people that are genuine about that. And it's amazing what's happened in only 6 years. 6 years.
Further to that, you're seeing a lot of these opportunities come, and corporations and businesses, industry, extending the hand, partner, and all these new initiatives. It's very positive. And I like to credit him for all of that, and going forward, it needs to be amplified. That message needs to be shared with Canada, because we all don't oppose development. Again, it has to be balanced. It certainly does. But in the same sense, if we're seeing benefit, where we can do our own programming, you see it all the time with the social media and the social pathologies our communities are stapled with: murdered, missing Indigenous women, opioid crisis, bad housing, bad water. We can't take care of that with going like this to the government. We have to find a way to do it ourselves.
Anyways, there's still lots of people who think that First Nations are automatically against all resource development projects for environmental reasons, whatever. But I can tell you what's happened in the last 6 years is an enormous number of people have started to realize when they're respectfully involved, why would they not be in favor? And the answer is they are.
Let me just comment. It's sort of interesting because on that side of the panel, we've got our Ontarians, and on this side of the panel, we've got our Western Canadians. And I think part of it is that our energy industry out West has felt so pummeled that we finally have realized the way to fight back on an image is to say, yes, we embrace environmental, social governance measures because we're better than anyone else, and we can do this better than anyone else. I'm thinking of Suncor, and they have a list of all of the incredible things that they do, and it's water recycling, and they do 72,000 hours among their employees of community charitable work, and they have Indigenous partnerships, and they have a certain percentage of their senior executive and leadership team that are First Nations or women or visible minorities. And so I don't feel like the energy industry is shirking away from that at all. I think the energy industry is saying, whoa, 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 whoa. Why is it that you've been focused so much on CO2 that you haven't looked at all of these other wonderful things that we're doing? And I think the light got shone on this in the last couple of weeks when we discovered how many international investment firms were investing in Russia instead of in Canada because of the sole focus on greenhouse gas emissions. One of the things that I like Jack Mintz writing about was maybe we need to build into our measures some measure of what a good citizen is of a particular country. Because when you're talking about offshoring, if a company leaves Canada and goes to one of these regimes where they have much worse measures on the environment, on social, and on governance, how is the world better off because of that? So I'm feeling a little bit more like there's an embrace of the environmental social governance than there is in Ontario, and maybe it's just a different perspective because I don't even know how much energy production takes place in Ontario. You might know that, but you're more energy consumers than producers, and maybe you haven't seen the same kind of push and the same kind of demonization that the energy companies have out west.
Well, I think Catherine gets to a core point, which is, all of consultants and all trying to find a way to make money off this and become sort of rent seekers. That's the part I'm really worried about, and I agree with you on. But I do think that for our industry and industry generally, we certainly need to show that we care about the things our customers care about. Even if I never meet that person in Ontario who fills up their car with a tank of gas, I have to start to understand that person wants to feel good about driving their SUV, and they're not going to feel good about it unless they understand that our companies or our industry cares about those impacts and that we're doing something about it.
I think too. Our politicians haven't done us any favors, and maybe that's always the case in Canada. But I think there's been so much divisiveness that I know, for example, from the businesses that we represented, our coalition, they're so supportive of the Canadian energy industry, and yet a lot of your sort of average Main Street Ontarian wouldn't fit into that category. They think, the West, and they're totally different, totally different philosophy, and that's the polluting part of the country. And this is unfortunately the kind of image that's been promoted for an awfully long time, and it's been bought into, regrettably, by a not insignificant number of people.
Right. Dan, did you want to jump in too?
Yeah, not to what Catherine is saying, but to perhaps a PSA, a bit of advice to Suncor.
Yeah.
Put it on your pumps.
Right.
In Ontario. Why not tell people what you're doing? I think Catherine and I experience a lot of folks that, we say, that's just ignorant. It's not. They're not informed. They're not aware of this. I think you go a lot further. If every Petrocan station in Canada were to have a little thing saying, rather than pump talk about gas prices, here's what we're doing. Now, look, I deal with this industry every day. They don't like me because I predict gas prices. But I can tell you, this is worth its weight in gold.
All right. Michael, did you want to weigh in too?
Well, I'll just make a bit of a quip, but I do see a certain irony in people from downtown Montreal and downtown Toronto talking to people in Alberta about clean air and clean water because we got it. Right, and I've been in downtown Toronto and Montreal, and you don't, right? So, but I do think there's something in that if you can be in downtown Montreal or Toronto and be thinking that somehow people out in Alberta are not caring about the environment, well, it's probably because you haven't been here and haven't seen it, but it's also because we haven't done a good job telling people how much we care about it.
All right, we've got a question from the floor.
Thanks, you guys. Robert Greaves from GMS Aggregates. I just a couple of quick comments, and then Stephen, a question for you on Cedar LNG in terms of an example. of a First Nation ownership or owned project. So just quickly, on the ESG side, and Stephen, depending on how much you know about Cedar LNG, maybe you can comment on it as an example of something that Chief Crystal Smith and her counselors have done in terms of ownership of an actual pending LNG project that has majority ownership from a First Nation community.
Yeah, I really don't know too much about it. You probably can teach me, to be honest, but obviously, like she's very supportive of it. We were both on a panel in Ottawa one time, and she was very adamant that, the LNG is probably the only place they want to play. Yeah. And anything with bitumen, keep it away.
So I've known her for 15 years. Yeah. Very strong leader. Her comment is, we're sick of managing poverty and all of the social issues that go on around poverty. LNG Canada has done an extraordinary job working with the community, working with the Heisland, others near and throughout their pipeline in terms of Coastal GasLink. But that project specifically has used international money, and they've traveled to do forward contracts on that agreement. Mike, you may know some of this too, just from being in the business. But the use of an FPSO and various other technologies to mitigate some of the challenges. And universally, when they've gone to Japan, when they've gone to Korea, elsewhere, the fact that it's going to be Indigenous managed and an Indigenous project earns them a lot of interest, forward contracts. And they're just right now going through their environmental reviews. So
Thanks for that. I want to get Stephen to comment on this because you haven't used the line before, but I've heard you say it on other panel discussions where you talk about how oil and gas is the new buffalo. Our business is the new buffalo.
Well, it's been the new buffalo since 1968, or 62, in near Muscatcheese, where I grew up with the Bonnie Glen pool. And by the way, before I get there, I will be on a panel with Chief Crystal tomorrow in Vancouver. It always been, the resource has always been around us. And we've had hard lessons, through the years. Industry wasn't the best and friendly ally, and government certainly didn't help us, with Indian Minerals West and now Indian Oil and Gas Canada. We've had hard lessons. But, what we've been able to retain from what we've done as far as exploration is, I credit my dad. He took the government to court. He actually got control of our oil and gas money. And at the time when it took 18 years to get there, but when the dust settled, we're holding on to our trust of $350 million. Today it's worth $560 million. We invest money all over the world, and it subsidizes our community. We better housing, better programs, but it's still an Indigenous, because the federal government now looks at us and says, you don't need our comprehensive funding agreement. You don't need our program money. So we're not giving it to you. So now we have to sustain ourselves with this. But, it's definitely helped. We have an education trust. It helped me through my years of, I should have been a doctor. I've been in school so long, but but it helped me through that. And it's helping all these younger people through it. There's tons of benefit from it. And of course, we needed strong partners. And as time evolved, we did find those people. And it's been very good.
I wonder if, Michael, you might want to use that as a jumping off point to talk about, it's interesting, this transformation you were referring to. It feels to me today like the very first question somebody asks when they've got a new project is, can we find an Indigenous partner? And I don't know that was the case 6 or 7 years ago, but it is a genuine partnership. It's not just a community benefits agreement these days. It really is equity share, and it is a partnership. And I'm wondering how important that is in being able to attract investment. It sounds like it's receiving some international recognition when you can take it to the market and do that. Are you seeing that too?
Well, I'll bring something that we'll bring into Ukraine, because I was operating over in Republic of Georgia just as the Civil War was ending, and we were in Baikop, Russia. We ran the Poltava gas field, which is in eastern Ukraine. It's barely kilometers from the front lines right now, and so I was over there. And I'll tell you the one thing that I learned there, and I've learned in other international places, you cannot take valuable things, whether it's oil, gas, gold, whatever minerals from underneath people's feet, and have them not feel they need to be part of it. And so this has nothing, I always said this has nothing to do with First Nations. They're no different than an Alberta rancher, and they're certainly no different than the average Ukrainian who expects, as you're taking gas from the Poltava gas field, they're expecting some local benefits. So when I came back to Canada, was doing business, it just seemed completely natural to me to work with the First Nations in the same way that I was working with Georgians or Ukrainians or whomever. And of course, my one line is that First Nations are pussycats compared to the Ukrainians, right?
Danielle, I sit with the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation as a chair, and I seen all these deals that are coming in from industry, and they're great deals, but they are lacking an Indigenous partner, and for it to go through our program. So it's positive that there's good opportunities out there. It's just hard to, there is no book on relationship building. No. You have to become a Himoke yourself. You got to find that transition. You know what a Himoke is? No. Should I tell them what a Himoke is?
It feels slightly risky, but we're in Western Canada.
It's not Ukrainian.
It's not Ukrainian. A Himoke is that individual that actually been in the community, has done this. They're usually consultants, lawyers, or accountants. And they're in the community, and they're all over the place. They know everybody, and everyone knows them. And then when they walk into a chief and council chamber and the elder says, "Who in the hell's that white guy?" Chief will say, "Hey, him okay." But we need these people. We need that help because, certain areas we do lack a bit of the capacity, to understand not only markets, equity markets, the commodities, oil and gas, and how leases work and everything like that. And we need to teach you on how we're stuck and how this Indian Act works and and how the land works, and then kind of teach you a little bit about the culture, why we think that bush there is important because it has berries, medicines, and everything else. So don't chop it away. Yeah. Move it over to this side where you can drill your rig, stuff like that.
Thanks for that, Stephen. We're going to get one last question from Paul because Dan has done something like 310 interviews in the last month. You can imagine he's very high demand. He's got another one to go to. But Paul, give us one more question here.
I'll make this one a quick one. We've obviously talked a lot about all the great things that the industry is doing and the challenge of getting the messaging out there. I think with the best will in the world, the current occupant of Sussex Drive is not really going to suddenly have a conversion on the road to Damascus, however the information is presented. And I think a lot of the people that are voting him in or have voted him in, they're going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult to get them to change their views. We talked quite a bit, interestingly, about Russia and Ukraine. I kind of think we have a real opportunity now because, frankly, by promoting Canadian oil and gas in terms of not just improving the environmental footprint versus Russia, which a number of people have mentioned, but the energy security, it's also going to help with that constituency that are currently voting for anti-oil and gas parties here in Canada. It's the same constituency that is probably really upset about what's going on in the Ukraine at the moment. And I think there's a real powerful argument for marketing to those people that by using Canadian oil and gas, we can substitute every Russian barrel of oil and every million cubic feet of natural gas that Europe is getting from there, and even Canada at the moment, with responsibly produced oil and gas from Canada. If we can get that message through, that will be worth a hell of a lot of other work in trying to convince them that somehow we're more environmentally friendly, etc., which we are. But it's getting that message through, and I'm just wondering what the panel think about that. Thank you.
It's a great comment, Paul. I know that Dan's gotta hit the road here, but let me, while you're heading off the stage, let me turn that question over to Michael if you want to give a comment on it.
Well, I think that what's happening in Ukraine, just as you said, is that it's showing that it's gone from an opportunity for Canada to step up as a senior partner in the world and be that guarantor to the whole Western world that they can access the resources they need to live their lives, to run their economies, and to know that they can't get pushed around by anybody else because there's a Canada that's going to step up and be that person. And I think it's gone from being an opportunity that we've been missing for 20 years to being an obligation. We have to do it now.
Okay. Stephen.
Like for a First Nation standpoint, we don't see a border. And right now, like I want to ensure that we have energy security and food security. You know, last week I was down in Denver to meet with a senior high person in the Department of Energy under the Secretary of Interior. We had sent a letter to the Secretary of Interior to ask for a meeting, because all of these energy policies that are happening in both Canada and the United States are being done without First Nation input. And we'll always want to have a say, you know, so we don't have these demonstrations, you know, Dakota Access, you see it, Wet'suwet'en, all that. We want to have a say, and we want to secure our so my hope is to bring her up here, show her the oil sands, take her to a pump jack, you know, go to an LNG facility, you know, something that we do really good here in Canada, so that they're comfortable when they take our oil and our energy. You know, that's the goal. You know, if it's Indigenous led, you know, because she has the ear of that, what's that guy's name? Joe Biden? Yeah. Joe Biden. Yeah, she has the ear of him. And if we can prove to her that not only are we working together, but we're seeing benefit for the communities, I think that's going to say a good statement.
Well, I hope so. I hope it goes better than the last time Leonardo DiCaprio or Jane Fonda visited. So we wish you luck on that. We're about to wrap it up here. Let me let Catherine Swift have a bit of a summary on some of the things that she took away from today's discussion.
Wow. Well, boy, I come away from this more optimistic than I entered it, which I must say I didn't expect. Your perspectives, and again, there's certainly regional issues here that are very interesting. And even though, yes, we all know that, it's interesting to see them play out and how they play out. But certainly the message to me, the main message here is, you know, keep on that communications bandwagon, because we have to do an end run of a lot of the politicians that are being unhelpful. Certainly a lot of people in the environment movement that just seem to want to pursue policies that punish Canadians by and large, don't really accomplish a whole heck of a lot in terms of the environmental movement. But mind you, they're all usually earning pretty good salaries. I read something recently that maybe the only thing that's really sustainable is high salaries for these people in these various environmental organizations. And get that message across. And I really agree with your comments about the opportunity that it's an unfortunate type of situation that triggered this opportunity, to put it mildly. It's a horrendous situation, but it's certainly one to get the message out, a message that was always true. But it's something that people will pay attention to perhaps more because of that context, more so than they would have otherwise. Because we've had a great story to tell for a long time. This isn't just a recent phenomena, but it's hard to get it out when you're hitting that wall all the time of a lot of our elected representatives and the environment and the media. Let's face it, we haven't really talked a lot about a lot of the media. I look at First Nations, Stephen, and you have a half a dozen Wet'suwet'en elders, and they're opposing it. You would think the entire community was opposing it if you read the conventional media stories, and of course that's not the case. So it's a big challenge, but obviously staying on the track and using the opportunities presented look promising.
All right, timing is everything, and we are now out of time. Thank you all so much for participating with us this evening. I'd like to thank my co-host, Catherine Swift, President of the Coalition of Concerned Businesses and Manufacturers of Canada. We, of course, had Tim Egan, President of the Canadian Gas Association, Dan McTeague, President of Canadians for Affordable Energy, Stephen Buffalo, President of the Indian Resource Council, and Michael Binnion, President of Questar Energy, as well as Executive Director of the Modern Miracle Network. We, of course, learned this evening that we can have energy security, energy affordability, and we can produce Canadian energy with respect for the environment and our First Nations communities. We hope you enjoyed this town hall. I'm Danielle Smith. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you again.